Let's talk about how people ignore the signs of a coming massacre. So many people today have this mentality of, well, those massacres of the past, that's not going to happen in our own times, at least not in the Western world, at least not in European lands, because we have transcended all of that. We have evolved from those dark ways of the past. It's not going to happen in our own era. We have come such a long ways from that dark epoch of our great-grandparents, from those moribund days, from those depressing, violent ideologies that so many people believed in decades and decades and decades ago. We are not going to repeat that again. Are you kidding me? Come on. And so many people today have this way of thinking. And what is so tragic is that people who lived in the massacres of the past, in the massacres of the 20th century, also had that same mentality. They also thought, why would I be killed in a massacre? I've done no wrong to anyone. And so they sat quietly in their homes, thinking that nothing bad is going to happen to them. And then, one day, a group of men come into their house. They're armed with axes, they're armed with knives, and before they know it, the father is forced to watch as his children are tortured and murdered. And then he is executed. Just recently, I watched a documentary. It's a Polish documentary that I think all of you guys should watch. It came out in February of 2020, so it's quite recently made. And it is about the Volinia Massacre. It is about how Ukrainian nationalists, led by the fanatic racist Stefan Bandera, butchered around 60,000 Poles simply because they were Poles. Volinia was a region that at one point in time belonged to the Ukrainians, but then in the post-World War I era was given over to the Poles. The Ukrainians didn't like that, and so they decided to commit a Holocaust, and they butchered tens of thousands of people. I'm going to put a link of the documentary in the description because I want all of you guys to watch this, because you will see photos in this documentary that parallel things that we are seeing right now, things that we have been seeing in these last few years. Pictures of Ukrainian nationalists holding up flags. These were fanatic Ukrainian nationalists who worshipped blood and soil. They were subscribers to the religion of race. And you see these photos of them holding up their flags. And they're in black and white. So when you see a black and white photo, it detaches us in a way from those times. It kind of acts like a hindrance from making the parallel to our own times, because it's black and white, it's old, and so we associate such photos with the far past, from some very, very old time period that has no relevance to our own times. But look at these photos and just imagine them in color. You can see the parallel between those old black and white photos and photos from our own time. Because today we see nationalists holding up flags. We see nationalists in Ukraine, in Hungary, holding up flags and doing these torchlight rallies. We've seen this numerous times in Germany as well. And yet, so many people look at these photos and they think, those are the good guys, those good nationalists, because they are defending their people from some evil migrants. And the fact that so many people in both Europe and in North America they see the nationalists in Europe as heroes really shows us that we haven't learned a damn thing from history. The reason why I think we don't learn from history is because we get caught up in the moment. We as human beings, it's part of our nature. We get caught up into the moment. It happens in our own personal lives. We tell ourselves, we're not going to get angry. I'm not going to get mad. I'm not going to lose my temper. I'm not going to eat a bunch of fried food today. And then we see the fried food and we start eating it. We get caught up in a moment. We lose our temper. Someone says something that we don't like, boom, we yell. We get caught up in the moment. We don't think, oh, I'm getting angry. Oh, I'm going to do the same mistake again. And we repeat the same mistake. What we see in individual human nature, we can see being done by entire nations. We can see being done by entire societies. Societies get caught up in the moment. They hear from people on Facebook, from Twitter, from Instagram, people from certain media outlets about how they're being invaded by migrants or how they are being attacked, that there is a war being declared on them by foreigners, by the outsiders. They believe it, and there is a series of emotions that are induced from this. There's fear, there's anger, there's hysteria, really. And so they look for a hero to lead them. And that's when you have the political opportunists taking advantage of them. And before you know it, these people who seemed like good, decent, maybe even Christian folk are following a monster, and they become monsters themselves. And there was one particular parallel that I saw in this documentary with something that I have seen in our own times. Before the Ukrainian fanatics butchered tens of thousands of Poles, they produced a book. It was called The 10 Commandments of the Ukrainian Nationalists, something roughly like that. I don't know the exact Ukrainian term for it, but in English it translates roughly into something like the 10 Commandments for Ukrainian Nationalists, something like that. You'll see it in the documentary. And one of the commandments said this. I'm going to read it to you because I don't want to paraphrase it. I want to give you the accurate statement. One of the commandments was this: "Thou shalt not hesitate to commit the greatest crime when the good of the cause requires it." And today, you find nationalists talking like this. A few years ago, I found a video that was filmed in Germany. It was a lecture that was being, it was actually a conference with a series of lectures that was organized by Austrian and German nationalists. They're part of a movement that called themselves identitarians. And they are led by several people. One of them is a former German soldier named Götz Kubitschek. And I think he was eventually reprimanded by the Bundeswehr, or the German armed forces. I don't remember the exact German term for it, but he was reprimanded by the German military for trying to inculcate Nazism amongst the soldiers. And now he is running a whole ultra-nationalist movement that really is just remarketed Nazism, to put it simple. And so he helped to organize this conference, and he was also helped by another nationalist by the name of Martin Sellner, who I debated back in 2017. And in this conference, they have a speaker by the name of Jack Donovan, and he is an American. He doesn't call himself a nationalist, but I think he calls himself a tribalist. Whatever he calls himself, he is a pagan citizen of Sodom who praises murder. He sanctifies the idea of bloodshed for the tribe, race war, essentially. And he speaks in this conference in very terroristic ways, really. He's promoting ideological terrorism in this conference. And he says in this conference that if you can get away with committing violence, and if the violence has a certain gain from it, to quote him, by all means, press play. In other words, if you commit violence and you can get away with it, and if the violence has a good result, has a result that is beneficial to your group, to your tribe, then go ahead and do it.
For the noble barbarian, there is no question as to whether violence against people who are not your people is good or evil, or even morally justified. The only important questions about violence are, do I want to use violence? Is initiating violence in this scenario likely to produce a desirable result? Do I have a tactically viable plan for executing this violence? Am I capable of executing this violence effectively to produce the desired result? What are the potential long and short-term risks involved in initiating violence in this scenario? Is the desired result worth those risks? If the answer to all of those questions is yes, then by all means, press play.
We are seeing things today that parallel what took place before the massacres that horrified the world in the 20th century. The massacres of the Poles, the Armenian Genocide. We are seeing things happen today that parallel with what took place in those days. But if you tell people, hey, we're seeing the signs, horrific things are going to happen. We're seeing the signs of global conflict. We're seeing the signs of global genocide. Oh no, that's not going to happen again. When I was watching this documentary, one thing that I noticed, I noticed a certain pattern. Because in this documentary, they interview people who lived through the Volinia Massacre, or people who had parents that were killed by the Volinia Massacre. They had relatives, things like that. All of these people, in some way or another, experienced the massacre and survived it. And the pattern that I noticed was how oblivious they were to the realities, the very dark realities that were coming for them. In one story, a woman talks about how her father could not believe that the Ukrainians were massacring her people. He couldn't believe it. She talks about how her father said, I've been very nice to these Ukrainian people. I follow the law. I follow the rules. Why would they want to kill me? That's not going to happen here. And so many people today have this mentality. So many people before the massacres done by the Nazis, so many people didn't think that would happen. So many Americans didn't even know who Hitler was until the United States entered the war. So many Americans didn't know that their government was sterilizing people because they were physically or mentally handicapped. I remember years ago meeting this old lady who was alive during the Second World War. Her father was an apple farmer in, I want to say, the state of Texas. And in the outbreak of the Second World War, this apple farmer lost pretty much all of his workers because they had to go fight in the war. And so this apple farmer had to use members of his own family to harvest the apples. She included, this woman that was telling me this. And so she had to pick apples with her father. And I asked her, did Americans really know a lot about who Hitler was? And she said, Americans didn't know who Hitler was until the United States entered the war. People are clueless. People generally are oblivious to what is taking place. I remember years ago talking to my great-grandmother, Dorothy. She was alive during the First World War and the Second World War, and she also survived the great 1918 influenza epidemic, or pandemic, really. And I said to her, Grandma, you were alive when the US government was sterilizing people under the eugenic laws. And she said, what's eugenics? And it was at that point that I realized in those days people were just as clueless as they are now. Let's not be those people.